Please welcome Andy Battentier with a warm applause, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I will make a little chronology of the last few months in the social movements that happened in France. I will start on 28th of August 2018. So since his election a bit more than a year before, Emmanuel Macron has won all his political battles. His party, designed to implement the executive's decision, holds the majority at the parliament. And at this moment, the president is perceived as able to implement any kind of policy. But the honeymoon period stops on August 28th, when the Minister of Ecology, the former TV presenter and non-ecologist Nicolas Hulot, decides to resign live on radio without warning anyone, a decision that he claims to have taken while coming into the studio. This decision shocks public opinion. He claims that the government does not take the problem of environmental emergencies seriously enough, that the total collapse of our conditions of living is happening, and that his presence in the government is the endorsement he no longer wants to give. He points that we are stubborn to maintain, eventually resuscitate, an economic model which is the source of all these disorders. He also points the collective responsibility. Indeed, he declares, what do I have to support me? Do I have a structured society that goes in the street to defend biodiversity? So in reaction to this event, a 27-year-old person, Maxime Lelon, not connected to any form of activism, launches a Facebook event called March for Climate. In the description of the event, he cites the words of the resigned minister. The event goes viral and accumulates tens of thousands of participants or interested. The event is initially planned of September 2nd, but Maxime is quickly contacted by environmental NGOs that ask him to move his event on September 8th to meet an international mobilization plan beforehand that day. In the end, he endorsed the role of a public face. He goes in the media with the role of the citizen who launched an environmentalist wake up, while the NGOs took care of the protest logistics. So, 60 events are similarly launched, mostly by people who had no previous connection to environmental activism, resulting in the largest climate mobilization ever seen in the country, gathering 130,000 people, including 50,000 in Paris. The mobilization was marked by a special enthusiasm in the protest, a particular happy atmosphere. Like the Parisian one, most events were launched by random citizens and organized in tandem with NGOs. So the sudden dimension of the event surprised everyone, and the question of what's next was as quickly as possible. So with a friend of mine, we thought, okay, it seems that nowadays everyone can launch a mass protest, so let's do it. That thing's not working. Ah, shit. We created another Facebook event that collected 20,000 interested people in 48 hours. People who mobilized on September 8th followed, and in the end about 80 cities were mobilized for October 13th. So unlike the previous Parisian protest, we decided to purposefully not emerge as mediatic figures. We wanted to spread the idea that everyone could and should do something about this problem, and we wanted a relative anonymity to show that random persons could actually launch significant events and actions. We chose to focus our efforts on setting different items at the end of the protest, such as stands of NGOs, scientific speeches, and a debate area. So while we were preparing this action, several Facebook events started to appear. They were calling to block the roads against the increase of petrol taxes on November 17th. They chose the yellow vest, which became mandatory in cars a few years ago, as a sign of rally. People participating in the climate movement were at first rather hostile to this new movement, which was however presented in the media as an apolitical movement which is supported by National Front, the far-right party. On November 17th, people gathered all over France, and there were probably over 1 million. It didn't appear as a far-right movement in the end, but as a very eclectic one. They opened toll barriers, they blocked the vehicle circulations on roundabouts, they protested into cities. In Paris, they tried to reach the presidential palace, calling for the president to resign, and they were repelled by the police. At the end of the day, many people decided to stay together, and hundreds of blocking points were transformed into camps that will then stay for weeks. These places were a basis for organization and the stage of an intense political debate that incrementally transformed the movement claims, from taxes on petrol to taxes in general, and then fiscal evasion, wealth distribution, and direct democracy. So on November 18th, a call to protest in Paris on November 24th was launched, with the objective to put a maximum pressure on the presidential palace. Barricades on the Champs-Élysées were built, and the concern that officials would have to leave the presidential palace was real. From this moment, the movement gathered each Saturday. So this is the participation numbers according to different sources, and you have at least 100,000. The first line is 100,000 people in the country. But the level of threat on the institution gradually diminished at the price of ferocious repressive measures. So this is like the accounts of what happened to people, like people were only going to protest, and this is basically what could happen to you. The political answer, however, has consisted in sporadic but non-systemic measures which were asked by the movement and so have been considered as insufficient by the movement itself. In the meantime, the movement for the climate continued with three major national mobilizations. December 8th happened in the midst of political violence, and the Minister of the Interior called to cancel the March for Climate in Paris. It happened anyway, and gathered 20,000 people in Paris, displayed its solidarity with the Yellow Vest movement. 130,000 people protested in France, and in many cities, the marches for climate converged with the Yellow Vest protest. On January 27th, another national mobilization happened, which took the shape of diverse mobilization, human chains, march. In Paris, we organized an agora, a space for debate that intended to drive individuals' mobilizations on specific topics, and that gathered about 5,000 people. On March 15th, there was the first massive occurrence. of the Fridays for Future movement. And March 16th, so the Marche du siècle, the March of the Century, for social and climate justice, gathering 350,000 people in France. So at the beginning of the Yellow Vest protest, people from the ecological movement were annoyed, as I said, by the Yellow Vest movement. So this is what a picture that went on social media that says, here is up, you have what's happening when the price of gas is rising, and what's happening when the temperature on the planet is rising. It's kind of ironic statement, but however, a form of ideological convergence happened between the two movements. Yellow Vest claims always include the necessity of ecological transition, and marchers for climate generally acknowledge that an ecological society cannot be coercive on lower classes. However, in many towns, Yellow Vest and people that march for climate just simply operate together. Preliminary studies performed by the research collective Quantité Critique confirms a profound difference in the sociology of both movements. The Yellow Vest movement emerged first and foremost in middle-sized towns and rural areas. It was mostly composed of popular classes, unemployed and low-level salaried workers. It's marked by populist vote, either on the left for 80% and 19% on the right, and abstention for 15% of votes. But every political current is represented in it, as you can see on the graph on your right. Most people do not assimilate themselves to a pre-constructed political identity such as left or right, as you can see on the left. And concerning ecological issues, most people perceive that the global catastrophe is ongoing and that structural answer to the problem shall be given. 2/3 approve taxation of air traffic, development of local train, and glyphosate interdiction. On the side of March for Climate, at the beginning, it's a more urban movement with a predominance of executives and intellectual professions, 40% against 8% of employees in Paris. But the mobilization is rather anchored on the left, with 65% of interviewees having voted for a left candidate in the last presidential election. 82% of polled individuals consider also that getting out of capitalism is a necessity to solve the ecological crisis. So what we seem to have is two classes with potentially divergent interests, but a momentary ideological convergence over the necessity to overcome neoliberalism, which is exacerbated politically and symbolically in France by the president who is exerting a policy à la Thatcher. And strategically speaking, both movements are extremely complementary. On the social field, they mobilize two classes that are rarely politically in contact in daily life. The Yellow Vest movement carried the strains of mass protest and mobilized on a quasi-constant basis tens of thousands of people, sometimes hundreds of thousands, in a movement that is expanding slowly in different sectors of French society. Pictures of riots, as well as systematic disapprobation in the government and mainstream media, has, however, carried a controversial picture of the movement. But nevertheless, the movement is still supported by a majority of French people, according to recent polls. On the other hand, the central thematic of the climate movement is symbolically extremely powerful because of its consensuality, given that the UN itself outlines the necessity of a massive and ecological transition that is scientifically incompatible with the current global economic model. It's extremely hard to be against the marches for climate. So no political figure can reasonably disapprove a pacific protest calling to save the planet, which sort of paradoxically led the government to support the marches for climate, claiming that this march were in support of their actions. This is a tweet from the Minister of Ecology, and the comments beside says, "Oh, hypocrites are out." So while the march were not actually really in support of the government. Initially, both movements tended to reject structured organizations. The distrust towards NGOs, unions, parties was significant in the March for Climate, as well as in the Yellow Vest. However, the implication of NGOs in the March for Climate Logistics made the movement fit their agenda in the middle term, while the Yellow Vest movement was more unpredictable. In the latter, some individual figures emerge, generally people not previously connected to social or political activism. But in general, the Yellow Vest more active members were proponents and coordinators of actions rather than leaders implementing an agenda conceived outside of the movement itself. To say a word about the role of digital technologies, it's important to note that online mobilization is only a trigger here. What fuels both movements in the long term was the power of face-to-face interaction. Meeting during protest, ritualization of a weekly meeting, creation of places of political debate on the road crosses. I think studies have shown that neoliberalism has dissolved social bonds. Hence, mobilizations that fascists must recreate opportunities of face-to-face interaction. In my opinion, in this context of weakened socialization, it's the role of activists to create, maintain, and animate these spaces where conflictuality can be expressed. Always in a spirit of coordination of an available energy over sensitization and pedagogy, which doesn't mean that activists shall not get ideologically involved in these spaces, but they shall be in a position of equality with newcomers and other participants, and trust the solidity of their reasonings as well as the benefits of constructive criticism. So to conclude, I would argue that the Yellow Vest and the Marches for Climate are the same movement. They have defined a common enemy, occurred with a similar pattern, and are both the political expression of an urge for survival. They are both powerful socially and symbolically, and carry the hope for a world that is fairer and sustainable. If their concrete political outcomes have been for the moment limited, they are the vivid core of French political life since almost a year. They are profoundly transforming the society, and I identify three values that are common to the two movements, which are solidarity, determination, and creativity, and it's kind of a good basis for a good start. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will continue with the questions from the audience. Продължуваме с прашања од публика, па ајде тука може да започнеме повелете.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. You said something along the lines that no political figure can reasonably be against climate action. I have one point and one question. First of all, you'd be surprised, especially in Macedonia. Second of all, I have a question because I don't know if I have enough information. Do you expect political figures in the European election to run on a pro-climate platform? Thank you.
Thanks for this question. It's a very good point. It's not really possible to politically stand against the climate movement because the situation as it is a consensus. I mean, there is a consensus over the fact that there is a problem. Where there is no consensus is about how to deal with it. And this is where conflictuality comes in. So generally, the message of this march, where there is a problem, we need both to do something and think about how to deal with it. So this was opening a space and sort of saying between the lines that the government is not doing enough, so criticizing the action, but the government took back this line saying, okay, we are we are doing so much for the climate, and they communicated on this while we were actually saying the opposite. So this is where, I mean, the consensus is on the what's happening, and what should be done is less consensual. And your second question was about the European election. I mean, I don't know exactly the context in all countries, but I know that in France, it had the effect that all parties, and I mean all parties, are putting that in their program. They are all talking about ecology, sometimes in very bad ways because they are recently converted. But still, you know, this is something that has finally been put at the center of the political attention, and this is already something that is important, in my opinion.
Продолжуваме понатака, таму има едно прашање доле повеле.
Well, can you share your thoughts with us about the violence surrounding the Yellow Vest movement and the damage done to cultural heritage, especially in Paris?
Damage to cultural heritage?
Yes.
I mean, there was, what are you talking about?
About painting ancient facades and destroying them.
You had paints, some walls were painted, of course, and there was, like, I think you're mentioning December 1st when the Arc de Triomphe was attacked. I mean, this is not, personally, I don't agree with that, obviously. And I mean, this is, most people don't agree with the fact of destroying stuff. But there is something important to know about violence in this movement, I think. And I was in Paris while the first occurrence of the movement happened. It was very, there was somehow the same atmosphere than in the marches for climate. There was no violence on November 17th, and also November 24th was more intense. Like nothing has been destroyed on this day. The question that has to be asked is, who is defining the level of violence? And the answer to that is that it's the state who has the monopoly of legitimate violence who is defining the level of violence. So, of course, you cannot agree with violence both morally and also pragmatically, because when you're an activist and you start to be violent, you are becoming a target, and usually it turns bad for you. But the violence level, it's the responsibility of the state, not of activists.
Thank you. Дали имаме други прашања од публика?
Hello. My name is Martin. I saw a piece of the action in Paris during the protests, and it was amazing, the number of people and the effect on the streets. But my question is the Yellow Vest group, is it doomed to become a self-contained echo chamber, in that the rest of the population being captured by all the distractions that exist around? Is there such a danger? So that, you know, unless your movement convinces all the rest of the millions of people in France, how will there be an actual effect and a change?
This is an actual danger, I think, for the movement, that somehow it's enclosed in one state. I mean, it's a very open movement which has not formulated particular claims or demand. It has formulated particular claims on demand, but it's more asking. It's asking for a systemic change, and that's not something you can actually put on paper right away. So you always run, and in this situation of uncertainty in front of you, then the government will try somehow to enclose you and saying they are not serious because they are not. They don't ask precise things, while you cannot, because you have to think about it before. So yeah, this is a danger. So far, it's a danger that has been avoided. It's changing somehow, but it's also, it's been like 6 months that these people are actually organizing protests at tens of thousands of people each week. So they are tired, obviously. And I don't know. I think the next political outcome is at least during the municipal elections, which are happening 1 year from now. And in the meanwhile, something can burst in because the movement has surprised everyone so far. So
Thank you. I have to interrupt you. Ке имаме време за уште едно кратко прашање од публика, за да може, затоа што времето веќе истече, меѓутоа затоа што видов дека имаш уште неколку раце кренато, па затоа. Повели.
Is it on? Yeah. Hi. What was the reaction of the government of these movements, besides Macron wanting to talk it out? And was the support of the Minister of Ecology that you showed was implemented in some kind of a policy?
For the second question, the answer is no. Yeah, they have basically made a couple of weak promises that they have betrayed since. So that's what happened. There are some stuff done, but it's not sufficient in our opinion. And what was the first question? I didn't understood you well. I'm sorry. Can you repeat the first question? But in front of the Yellow Vest or in front of the ecological movement? Both. The government is quite happy that ecological movement is happening. At least it's communicating it is. And it has been like very aggressive towards the Yellow Vest movement. As I showed, you had a lot of repression.
I'll have to interrupt you. Толку од прашањата, затоа што времето ни истече. Сега продолжуваме со следниот говорник. Ве молам уште еден аплауз за Battentier.